I hope you enjoyed the editing in this video as Jordan Peterson talks about how not everything is a psychological problem and how you can make anxiety and anger work for you instead of against you.
Like, we tend to think that a lot of us is inside our head. You know, that's the psyche model, basically. But the more I've practiced as a clinical psychologist, the less I've actually been convinced that that's true. So I could say, well, let's say I want to know about your personality. We think, well, I want to know you. I want to know about your subjectivity. I want to know what's inside of you. But that isn't actually what you do want to know if you're doing clinical work, say, with someone. You want to know, do they have any friends? That's really important, because if you're miserable and anxious and badly placed in life and misbehaving, one of the reasons that all of that can occur is because you don't have any friends, you don't know anyone. And that's not something that's inside you. It's you localized in a broader sphere. And then you might say, well, do you have a job? And well, let's talk about the job. Do you actually make enough money with your job? Is it satisfying for you in any way? Are you bullied all the time when you're at work? Does it provoke anxiety? Is it a career that allows you to go somewhere? Are you overworked? Well, but let's start with just the first question. Do you have a job? Well, if the answer to that is no, you have a serious problem, and that would enough might be to depress you and make you anxious and hopeless and nihilistic and all of those things. And you could say, well, you're not reacting very well to not having a job, but that's kind of a foolish objection, even though some of it might be true. One problem is that you're not reacting very well to not having a job, but another problem is that you don't have a job, and that actually constitutes a problem, right? You don't get to eat, you don't have a place to live. Those aren't psychological problems precisely, even though a psychological problem could make it worse. Well, are you as educated as you should be? That's another question. How do you handle drugs and alcohol? Are they taking you down a bad pathway? You know, what about intimate relationships? Do you have one? Do you have a plan for one? Or is that a never-ending series of catastrophes, or something that you avoid completely? That's a big problem. And maybe people aren't attracted to you for one reason or another. And you could think about that as a psychological problem, but it's an interpersonal problem. And the degree to which that's a psychological problem is certainly unspecified when you first begin to talk to somebody. What about your family? Do you have a family? Because it's hard to be in the world all by yourself, that's for sure. It makes things a lot more stressful, even though having a family can also be extraordinarily stressful. You know, do you have plans to have children? How are you doing with your parents? Do you get along with your siblings? You know, all of that, to me, is more fundamental, and it's outside of you. Those are elements of your experience, more broadly conceptualized, more than they are objects of your psychology or of your internal experience. You know, it's sort of like, well, a person is a creature that exists at multiple levels of analysis, right? Something might go wrong with you at a cellular level. So maybe you're born with a genetic abnormality. So something's wrong with you molecularly, or you have something wrong with a major organ, or maybe there's something wrong with you psychologically, or maybe you're in a pathological family, or maybe you're stuck in a pathological social system. And figuring out why you're suffering means going up and down those different levels, trying to specify the appropriate level for analysis and also the appropriate level for intervention. And for me, as I've said, even though I'm a great admirer of the psychoanalysts, and I do things like dream analysis, which I really find incredibly useful and enlightening, the fundamental level of analysis is, well, what's your experience structured like exactly? And that isn't localized in you. Now, the behaviorists do that too, because it's one of the things I really like about the behavioral approach to psychotherapy. It's very, very concrete and practical. It's like they'll say, well, there's certain things that you need to have in order to live properly, and maybe you don't have the skills or the wherewithal to accumulate them, and we'll break them down into tiny little pieces and you'll practice. So for example, with someone who doesn't have any friends, then you do a microanalysis of their social skills, say, and maybe an analysis of the kinds of anxiety that are stopping them from going out and meeting people, and then you address those things practically one by one. You try to get the person to have some friends, you try to figure out how they can establish an intimate relationship, you see if you can help them sort out their family, you do what you can about their employment, and a lot of that's only tangentially related to, really in some sense, to the structure of their psyche. But one of the things you'll see if you work as a clinician or as a counselor is that most of the time people come and see you because they have problems, not because they have psychological problems. And those things are not that easy to distinguish. You know, it's sort of the psychoanalytic idea is sort of like, well, if you just got your act together, everything would work out for you. It's like, yeah, there's some truth in that. But you know, if you're 55 years old and you've just been laid off work, and maybe through no fault of your own, it isn't obvious how much getting your act together is going to help you find another job, because the actual problem that you're facing may have relatively little to do with you. And that would especially be the case if you're maybe on the bottom half of the intelligence distribution, for example. And so it isn't as easy for you just to go out and pick up new skills at the drop of a hat, you know, and that gets harder as you get older because your IQ actually declines quite substantially as you get older. The working or the fluid intelligence part anyways, exercise can keep that at bay, by the way. It's the best way to keep that at bay. So anyways, you can think from the phenomenological viewpoint of your experience as a whole instead of you being a subject in an objective world. And so here's another way here's something that's quite useful. Jung talked about this because he was moving towards a phenomenological perspective later in his life. The last book he wrote was called Mysterium Conjunctionis, and he talked about 3 conjunctions that needed to take place in order for someone to be well constituted psychologically. And you know how Piaget talked about learning that you could not only follow rules, but that you could make rules for new games as sort of the highest level of moral development. I would say Jung extended the Piagetian moral continuum up past what Piaget had envisioned. Now, he didn't do that because he wasn't trying to extend Piaget's model, but you can think about it the same way. And it's not easy to come up with a moral mode of being, say, that transcends the ability to make rules for new games. That's damn smart, man. That's a major home run by Piaget as far as I'm concerned. But Jung said something like this. He said, look, when you're going through the process of psychological integration, here's a way of conceptualizing it. And he thought about this as symbolically as male-female pairings, because as I've tried to point out, one of the most fundamental categories that our mythological imagination uses to structure the world is the category of masculine and feminine. And it moves that around. You know, it's a fundamental metaphor, so you can move that around anywhere. And so Jung thought, well, one of the things that you're trying to do is to get your thoughts and your emotions integrated. And so, you know, the classic Enlightenment viewpoint, roughly speaking, is something like passion is the enemy of reason, right? And so to the degree that you're rational, it's sort of a Freudian viewpoint. It's because you got your emotions under control. And there's some truth in that, but not enough truth. I like the Piagetian idea better, which is that, no, that isn't what happens. What happens if you're playing the proper game is that you integrate your emotions underneath your thinking, something like that. So they're all working in the same direction, you know. So, for example, you can make your anxiety work against you or for you. And one of the ways I made a program called the Future Authoring Program that I think helps people do that. Because one of the things you see when you're talking to people and they're trying to solve problems is that they're afraid to face the problem. And so then their anxiety is working against them, and you can think about it as antagonistic to rationality. But then I could say, well, why don't you think for a while about what your life would be like if you didn't face this problem? Because if you think that through, if you have a problem and you really think through what the consequences are going to be in 3 to 5 years of not facing it, then you're going to get more afraid of not facing it than facing it. And that's great, because then your anxiety, instead of standing in front of you, instead of you having a dragon that's guarding the path in front of you, you have one chasing you down the path from behind. That's a lot more useful. And so, you know, that's just a minimal example of the utility of getting your emotions and your thoughts aligned the same way. The same thing happens with aggression. You know, one of the most common reasons that people come and seek psychotherapy really is because they're too agreeable. But what that means is they're not assertive enough. They haven't integrated their capacity for aggression, and so other people can push them around. And they're very conflict avoidant. And so the consequences of that across time is that you don't stand up for yourself well enough, and you get taken advantage of, and that spirals badly downward. And so partly what you do when you're doing assertiveness training with people is you find out what they're angry about. And they're usually angry if they're not assertive enough because other people are taking advantage of them, or you could say because they're not putting their own necessities forward with enough force. It's hard to distinguish between those two things. But anyways, you get them to talk about what they're angry about. That often makes them cry, often many times. And then you get them to kind of envision what they would want to have instead, which they're often afraid to do because people are afraid to think about what they want, because that makes it more clear when they're not getting it, and that's painful, right? Or maybe they're afraid of hoping, so they won't specify a clear aim. But anyways, you get them to think about what they might want instead. You get them to think about the costs of not pursuing that, and then you help them develop strategies for integrating their aggression and with their thinking so that they can come up with a plan to approach the world in a more confident way. So for example, someone might come to me and say, I'm being bullied badly at work. And so then I'll say, well, what are your options? Do you have to put up with it? Well, we'll figure that out, because maybe you do. Maybe you don't have options. But here's how to find out. Get your damn CV together so it's pristine, right? It's ready to go. Get over your fear of a new interview, because people are generally afraid of that. Get over your fear of applying for a new job. Start thinking about what it would mean to have a different job. Start thinking about what it would mean to have a better job even, because maybe your fear is just making you stuck here. But I can tell you one thing, if someone's picking on you at work and you don't have options, you lose. So you get the person to start building a strategy. It's like, okay, if you're going to tell this person to stop, you have to know how to make them stop. And the one thing you need for sure is an option. And if you don't have an option, then maybe we start thinking about the fact that you need some more training or something like that, because you cannot negotiate if you don't have any power. So, because especially if you're dealing with someone who's really out to get you or really disagreeable, if you don't have a leg to stand on, they'll just push you over, and maybe they'll jump on you too, because that's what they're like and they enjoy it anyways. So it's no joke. So you put your options behind you, and then you start to think about strategy. So I tell people, look, if you're being harassed at work, you document it every time it happens and you write it down. So you've got like 20 stories about it, and it's fully documented. And then you go confront the person at some point, but with at least 3 pieces of evidence. And you have some sense of what you tell them about what will happen if they don't stop. So you have to figure out, well, if they don't stop, what are you going to do about it? Leave? Not if you can't leave. So you have to be able to, wield a big stick and speak softly. But you see, that way that's how you take your aggression, which is an absolutely necessary part of your psyche, and manifest it up into a sophisticated means of dealing with the world. You don't just suppress it. You say, well, I should be able to put up with it, or I wish I wasn't so angry, or something. It's like, forget that. That's all that'll happen is your blood pressure will stay high and you'll die of a heart attack, because anger, for example, is a very toxic emotion. And it does cause heart damage over time. It's the only emotion that we really know that's been linked to things like cardiovascular risk. And anger is toxic, because it's like you're driving a car, you're stepping on the gas and pushing on the brake at the same time, because anger tells you to run away and to attack at the same time, because you don't know what's going to happen. And so it really amps up the physiological demand on your body. And so if including your heart and your musculature. So if you stay like that for like 10 years, you're going to age 20 years. And that's a bad plan.